My name is Margaret, and I have learned that the heart does not always heal through big events. Sometimes it heals through quiet moments, a warm breeze, a soft sky, a silence that finally feels peaceful instead of empty. That is what happened to me on the day I watched the sunset and realized I was still needed. It began like any ordinary afternoon, the kind of afternoon that seems too small to hold a life lesson. My home was quiet, and the light coming through the window had that gentle gold color it gets when the day begins to slow down. I had been sitting in my chair for a long time, holding a cup of tea that had already cooled, listening to the clock tick as if it were counting out the hours of my life. I wasn't sad exactly, but I wasn't full either. There was a hollow space inside me that I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the sharp grief of loss. That kind of pain had softened over the years. This was something quieter, something that felt like being forgotten by the world. When you reach my age, people stop asking you what you want. They ask what you need. Food, medicine, transportation, those things matter, of course, but they are not the whole story. The heart doesn't only need practical care, it needs meaning. It needs to know that it still has a place. That afternoon, I looked out the window and watched the sky change color. I saw the sun lowering slowly, as if it were tired too, and something inside me whispered that I needed to step outside, not for exercise, not for errands, but simply to breathe somewhere bigger than my four walls. So I stood up slowly, with the patience my body now demanded. My joints protested softly, but I moved anyway. I took a light cardigan from the hook by the door and draped it over my shoulders. I grabbed my small handbag, the one I carry when I don't need much, and I paused in the hallway for a moment, as if I were waiting for someone to tell me it was all right to go. No one did, so I told myself. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. It carried the scent of grass and distant trees, the kind of scent that reminds you the world is alive even when your days feel still. I walked slowly down the path near my building, letting my feet choose their own pace. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. For once, I wasn't trying to catch up with life. I was simply walking alongside it. As I moved, I noticed details I usually missed. The way sunlight touched the leaves, turning them almost transparent. The way birds moved through the branches with quiet confidence. The soft sound of wind, like a low, gentle song. Nature doesn't hurry. Nature doesn't panic. Nature simply continues. And something about that steadiness soothed me. I reached the small park not far from my home, a place I had passed many times but rarely entered. There was a path that led to a bench facing open sky. I made my way toward it, feeling a strange mix of loneliness and comfort. It was lonely to walk alone, but it was comforting to know I could still choose where to go. When I reached the bench, I sat down carefully. The wood was slightly cool beneath me, and I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. From this spot, the horizon was wide. The sky stretched out like a quiet promise. The sun was halfway down now, painting the clouds with soft orange and pink. The colors were gentle, not loud. They looked like they belonged to a calm heart. I watched in silence, letting my breath slow, letting my thoughts settle. And as I watched, my mind began to drift backward, not to painful memories, but to meaningful ones. I remembered my children when they were small, running in parks like this, laughing so loudly it felt like the world was made of joy. I remembered packing sandwiches and wiping sticky hands. I remembered my husband standing beside me, pointing at clouds and making silly shapes out of them just to make the children laugh. I remembered holding his hand while the sun went down behind us, feeling as though life would always look like that. Back then, I never imagined I would one day sit alone on a bench and wonder what my purpose was. That thought made my chest tighten, not with bitterness, but with the quiet ache of time passing. Time takes things. It takes people. It takes roles. It takes the busy feeling of being needed every moment, and it leaves you with stillness. But as the sky deepened in color, something inside me began to change. I realized that perhaps I had been measuring my worth the wrong way. I had been measuring it by noise, by how often my phone rang, by how many tasks I had to do, by how many people depended on me in practical ways. But what if being needed isn't always loud? What if being needed is sometimes quiet? I watched the sun lower further, and the light touched the tops of the trees like a final blessing. I felt my eyes sting, not with sadness, but with something like recognition. I realized that I had been thinking of my life as though it was shrinking, but perhaps it was simply changing shape. I rested my hands on the bench and stared at them. They were old hands now. The veins were more visible, the skin thinner, the fingers not as strong. Yet these hands had held so much, they had loved so much, they had worked so much, and maybe, just maybe, they still had something to give. As if the universe heard my thought, a soft sound reached my ears, footsteps on the path behind me. I turned slightly and saw a young mother walking slowly with her little child. The child was holding a small toy and kept stopping to look at leaves and stones. The mother looked tired but patient. She smiled gently when the child pointed at something, even when her own shoulders sagged. They passed by me, and the child looked up at me with curious eyes. For a moment we simply looked at each other. Then the child smiled, a simple, honest smile that didn't need a reason. I smiled back. The mother nodded politely, and they continued down the path. It was such a small interaction, but it warmed me, because in that tiny moment I was seen, not as an inconvenience, not as a burden, but as another human sitting under the same sky. And the thought came to me quietly, like a whisper from the sunset itself. You are still here, Margaret. You are still part of life. You are still needed. And the thought that I was still needed didn't arrive like a dramatic revelation. It arrived gently, the way sunlight arrives on a cold morning, not forcing anything, simply warming what has been stiff for too long. I sat there on the bench and watched the young mother and child disappear down the path, and I realized that even a brief exchange can remind you that you still belong to the world. The sky continued changing. The orange deepened. The pink softened into something closer to gold. The sun was slowly lowering behind the trees, and the shadows stretched longer across the ground like quiet hands reaching out. I listened to the wind moving through leaves and felt my own breathing slow into the same rhythm. I began to think about all the times I had once been needed loudly, needed in ways that required my full body, my full time, my full energy. Children crying at night, meals to cook, homework to check, uniforms to iron, hands to hold, decisions to make. Back then, I sometimes complained about being tired. I sometimes wished for silence. I sometimes dreamed of an afternoon like this, where no one was calling my name every few minutes. And now that I had that silence, I realized something tender. Sometimes we don't understand what we have until it changes. I had been needed in ways that were obvious. Now I was needed in ways that were quieter, and that was why I had almost missed it. Quiet need doesn't feel like urgency. It feels like presence. It feels like the kind of comfort you bring without doing anything extraordinary. I thought of my neighbor checking on me. I thought of my grandson leaning toward my voice like it was a safe place. I thought of my daughter's brief calls, the way she softened when she heard tiredness in my tone. These were not loud responsibilities, but they were real connections. And perhaps that was the truest meaning of being needed. Not that someone requires you like a tool, but that someone's life becomes warmer because you exist in it. As the sun slipped lower, I noticed other people in the park. A couple walking slowly, talking quietly. An older man sitting on a different bench, watching the sky with the same patience I felt in my own bones. A teenager jogging past with headphones in, unaware of the beauty unfolding above. We were all under the same sky, each carrying our own story, each holding something invisible that the world didn't see. And suddenly, I felt less alone, not because I knew these people, but because I remembered something important. Loneliness is often the belief that you are separated from life, but life is everywhere, even in strangers, even in birds, even in sunset light resting on leaves. We are part of a bigger world, even when our personal world becomes smaller. I let that thought settle, and it softened the hollow place inside me. I turned my face slightly upward and let the warm last light touch my skin. It felt gentle. It felt forgiving. It reminded me of all the evenings I had once spent with family, the way sunsets used to signal dinner time, laughter, warm kitchens. The memories were bittersweet, but not painful. They were proof that I had lived, proof that I had been loved. And then another memory came, not of my family, but of myself. I remembered the younger Margaret, the one who used to walk faster, the one who used to think life had to be productive every second, the one who believed rest was laziness and silence was wasted time. That Margaret had been so busy proving her value that she rarely paused to simply be. And now, here I was, older, slower, softer. I realized that age had not only taken things away, it had also given me something. It had given me a deeper way of seeing. It had given me patience. It had given me appreciation. It had given me the ability to find meaning in a small moment, like a child smiling at a stranger on a bench. The sun was close to the horizon now. The sky was glowing, and the edges of the clouds looked like they were burning softly. I felt tears gather in my eyes again. Not sadness, gratitude. The kind of gratitude that makes you feel humble, like you've been given a gift you didn't earn. I thought about the word needed. When I was young, being needed meant exhaustion. It meant constant demands. It meant no time for yourself. But now I understood a different meaning. Being needed does not have to be heavy. It can be gentle. It can be a quiet role you play simply by being who you are. Perhaps my presence was needed in my family, not because they couldn't survive without me, but because love is passed down like warmth. My voice, my listening, my patience, these things were threads holding generations together. And even if people didn't say it every day, that didn't mean it wasn't true. The wind picked up slightly and I pulled my cardigan closer. The air was cooling as the day prepared to close. It reminded me that everything changes, light into darkness, summer into winter, youth into age. But change doesn't mean ending. Change means continuation in a different form. I sat a little longer than I planned. I didn't check my phone. I didn't think about dinner. I didn't worry about time. I simply watched the sun finish its slow descent, and in that watching, I felt my heart relax. Then something else happened. A small voice behind me said, "Excuse me." I turned. The young mother had returned, her child beside her. The child was holding a small flower, slightly crushed but still bright. "My son wanted to give you this," she said gently. "He said you looked lonely and he wanted you to smile." The child held out the flower. For a moment I couldn't speak, because in that moment the world answered my doubt with tenderness. I took the flower carefully in my old hands and smiled at the child. "Thank you," I whispered. "This is beautiful." The child beamed and ran ahead again. The mother looked at me with softness. "He likes making people happy," she said almost apologetically. "No," I said, shaking my head with warmth. "It's a wonderful thing." She nodded and they walked away. I sat there holding that small crushed flower like it was a treasure, and I realized with complete clarity that I was still needed, not for labor, not for speed, not for productivity, but for something far more human, for kindness, for presence, for softness. And for softness, I realized, the world is always hungry. It doesn't always show it. People walk quickly, speak sharply, protect themselves with busyness and distance. But beneath all of that, almost everyone carries the same hidden wish: to be seen, to be cared for, to be treated gently. Sitting there with that small crushed flower in my hand, I felt as if I had been given a reminder straight from life itself. I stayed on the bench until the sun fully disappeared. The sky turned deeper, the orange melting into purple, the last light fading like a quiet goodbye. Birds settled into the trees, the park became still, and the air grew cooler, pressing softly against my cheeks. I looked down at the flower again. It wasn't perfect. The petals were uneven, the stem bent a little, but it was honest. It was given with pure intention, and somehow that made it more valuable than anything expensive. It felt like proof that small kindness is not small at all. It can reach places inside a person that words cannot. As I finally stood up, I moved slowly, holding the flower carefully as if it might break. My knees complained softly, my back tightened the way it often does, but I didn't mind. The pain felt ordinary. What mattered more was the warmth inside me that hadn't been there when I left home. I began walking back along the path, and the world looked different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. The street lights glowed softly, the breeze felt less cold, even the sound of distant traffic seemed gentler, like a lullaby rather than a rush. And as I walked, I thought about my life. I thought about all the seasons I had lived through, the years of raising children, the years of building a home, the years of caring for others so deeply that I sometimes forgot to care for myself. I thought about the losses, the quiet, empty spaces left behind when people you love are gone. I thought about the way grief changes you. It doesn't simply hurt, it reshapes you. But I also thought about the love that remained. Love in memories, love in habits, love in the way my children still called me when they needed comfort, love in the way my grandson asked me questions he couldn't ask anyone else, love in the way neighbors sometimes smiled at me in the hallway, even if we didn't speak much. And then I understood something that made me stop walking for a moment. Love is not only something you receive, it's something you become. You become love through the way you live, through the way you speak, through the way you treat people when no one is watching. You become love through patience, through gentleness, through the choice to soften instead of harden. And maybe that is why older people are still needed, because after years of life, if you've been paying attention, you carry a certain tenderness that the world can't manufacture quickly. You carry perspective, you carry calm, you carry the ability to say, "This will pass," because you've watched storms come and go. You carry the ability to listen without rushing, and people need that, even if they don't know they need it. By the time I reached my building, my hands felt cold, but my heart felt steady. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step careful, my flower still in my hand. When I reached my door, I paused before opening it. I looked down the hallway and realized how many lives were behind those doors, some full of noise, some full of silence, some full of laughter, some full of quiet pain. We often live close to each other but separate, and yet the smallest kindness can connect us. I entered my home, turned on the light, and the familiar quiet returned. But it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a calm room waiting to be lived in. I walked to the kitchen and found a small glass. I filled it with water and placed the flower inside carefully. Then I set it on the table where the warm light could touch it. The flower looked even more delicate indoors, but also more precious. I made myself tea again, not because I needed it, but because it felt like finishing something gently. I carried the cup to my chair by the window and sat down. Outside, the sky was now dark, the stars faint, the world resting. I watched the streetlights glow and listened to the quiet in a new way. The quiet wasn't loneliness anymore. It was peace. I thought about the young mother's words. He said you looked lonely and he wanted you to smile. A child had noticed something adults often ignore. A child had responded with kindness without overthinking it, and that simplicity felt like a lesson. Sometimes being needed isn't about being busy. Sometimes being needed is about being the kind of person who can receive a small flower with gratitude, who can smile back, who can make another human feel seen. I realized then that I had been measuring my worth by the wrong kind of proof. I had been looking for evidence in schedules, in responsibilities, in noise. But worth is often quiet. It lives in the soft connections you don't always notice. It lives in the comfort your presence gives others, even when they don't say it out loud. And maybe, in a way, even strangers can need you. Not for your money, not for your speed, not for your productivity, but for your humanity, for your ability to smile, for your willingness to be gentle, for your quiet dignity. I leaned my head slightly against the chair and let myself breathe deeply. I felt tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes after your heart has stretched open, the kind that comes when you've allowed life to touch you again. If you're listening to my story right now, I want you to remember something. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how quiet your days have become. You are still needed. Maybe not in the ways you were needed before, but in ways that are just as meaningful. You are needed to remind people what kindness looks like. You are needed to show that gentleness is strength. You are needed to pass down warmth in a world that often forgets warmth. That night, I sat by my window with my tea, the small flower glowing softly on the table behind me, and I let a gentle smile appear on my face, the kind of smile that doesn't ask for attention, the kind that simply says, "I'm still here." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it fully. I was still needed.